Day 7, 11 Days of Remembrance. I thank you to all the veterans who fought so I could be free in the First World War and Second World War. Thank you, so I can do all my videos. Alright, let's go to the next chapter, shall we? Operation Barbarza. Hitler armies invade Stalin Russia. The Nazi invasion of Soviet Russia was probably the most memorized event of World War II. Despite the criticism of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, Hitler had always destroyed Stalin, and the Communists have always been seen as the Nazis' true ideological enemies. Hitler needed land in the east for his long-term liquidation. He then wore strategic reasons for the invasion. In June 1940, Stalin troops had marched into Romania to take back the former Russian province of Barbarza. Then they were recognized close to the Romanian official on president of Soviet Russia was linked on the agreement to return the province to them. Nonetheless, Hitler had his first to return the illusory of many of his generals. Napoleon's catastrophic adventure on Russia's soil was, after all, a step lesson of every military school, but Hitler managed to convince them that an invasion was simply a preemptive strike, and sooner or later Stalin would order his barbarian holds to order enough to ensure the Belarusian cities could be taken. The Russians would be unable to recognize and would be forced to come to terms. The generals were also prepared of the surrender of their armed forces. They had then seen for themselves the damage that the reduced Finns had managed to inflict on the Russians. For a part, Stalin was totally unprepared. Many of his best generals had already been murdered in Russia's pre-war pillage, and he ignored judgment given him by the Soviet spies returned from Tokyo, where officials were being kept in touch with German propagandists. The Soviet leader assumed that Hitler would not attack until the invasion. The British, in turn, passed on the correct President-to-date attack on Russia. Operation Barbarza began on June 22, 1941, the day before the anniversary of the Napoleon invasion of 1812. Over 3 million men, 7,100 guns, and 3,300 tanks were deployed across a 130-mile front. There was no declaration of war. General Rudolf von Britten led the Northern Army Group towards Moscow, and General Rud von Trusser took the Southern Army Group towards the Ukraine. The Red Army was to be trapped in the ruin of Russia, but gigantic pioneer prevented. I declare again today to place the faith and future of the Reich and our people in the hands of our soldiers. Hitler announced that good aid as well to fight. The Luftwaffe bombed 5 cities and hit 66 Soviet airfields. Since Stalin had previously ruled out any provision against attack in case of a war with Germany, the planes were caught lined up wingtip to wingtip. The Russian Air Force in the west was essentially destroyed on the ground. Stalin was appalled and just through the idea of asking the Japanese to mandate no clear orders emerged, and Stalin Russia would not a place where people were encouraged to take the immediate mobilization for Russia's 15 million strong armed forces began days after the attack. The first village of the Germans were surely a burning and its commander and with the commander of the German Panzer Corps. On 26th of June, Finland declared to renew its war on Russia on the German side. It was followed by Hungary the long day and despair. Stalin took himself away for 11 days. He emerged to address his people for the first time, 3rd of July. Astonished with his Georgian accent, as he referred himself as friends and applied not their communist peoples, but to their basic patriotism. He made his was not about to reform. Meanwhile, Hitler moved into a command center at Resberg, the wolf's lair, a mosquito-infested swamp in East Prussia, from when he was to conduct the war for the next 3 years. Blocked Great Ensign around Minsk, demolished the Red Army, divided, and some 300,000 prisoners were taken, and the mercenary and the world seemed to be conquered there, said witnesses. Without some to protect Red Army POWs had reason to doubt their chances under the Nazis. By the end of the war, almost 2 million had been murdered or preserved from starvation and disease. But along with the suggestion, the German generals made mistakes. The rapid advance had overextended their supply lines. Without Leningrad and Germans divided ground to halt, waiting for division, and there should counter the attack. The inhabitants were given enough time to the city into a fortress. There were also civilian and German high command. The Major General Heinz Goeben was to press on the Moscow. Hitler preferred to take the individual areas and the set. Many generals knew nothing about the economic aspects of war. He saw first. By 23rd August, already finished from the military atmosphere of the Wolf's Lair, and a tenth fewer into the plans were carried out immediately. His central forces were to divide the north, south, and leave the attack on Moscow until later. At the same time, Stalin made an important point, putting George Zhukov in charge of the defense of Leningrad. Zhukov won the first attrition stage of battle, and the city settled down. A siege within would last until 1944 and lead the starvation of a third of its inhabitants by effective version of the German army in southern Russia, and German advance had been much more defeated. Though von Ritter forced a Russian army of over 1 million men, its duty to defend itself was unlimited by Stalin's refusal to allow any kind of withdrawal. Any big pincer movement between Gordon and General Paul von Kut would allow around Kiev, and the time the Germans had moved to occupy Crimea in the Ukraine. At least a million more Russian prisoners had been taken, but in respect, the Russians were beginning to regroup their renounced its policy and led the waste into the retreat. Not a single locomotive, not a truck, nor a loaf of bread with literature of fuel was to be left behind, said Stalin. Whole units of Soviet troops suspected of cruelty were also summarily executed, and personal massacre was up in the force. Even though there were a suspected punishment of retreat behind the Russian lines, it was also German, although a section of the Soviet military infrastructure had been wiped out, but Russia is an enormous country. Under the co-direction of future Russian Premier Alexander Kravchuk, the country's entire capacity was moved eastward, and soon many factories were back in production. By the following year, 3,000 aircraft and 2,000 tanks a month were rolling off the production lines. Churchill's reaction had been swift on hearing of Barbarza. We have but one aim and one single purpose, he said. We are resolved to destroy Hitler and every vestige of the Nazi regime. It follows that we shall give whatever help we can to Russia and the Russian people. The help increase passing the codes by using of the invention army of the cracked by the British on 27th June via Switzerland. The alliance between Churchill and Stalin was almost as particular as previous alliance between Stalin and Hitler. If Hitler invaded hell, said Churchill, I should at least make a formidable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. Stalin applied for help from the beginning, and although the British refused to open a second front in Europe, at this stage Lord Barbarza ran the regard of opposition from the service and had to divert some American resources to Russia instead. On the 28th of September, the first Arctic convoy left Iceland bound for Archangel. British and American convoys would shortly be paving the large amount of equipment to the Soviets, including 600,000 pairs of army boots a month. Churchill was claiming launched the Aid for Russia program. Support for Russia was increased by stories of Nazi orders and occupied territories by Churchill asserted that since the Mongol invasion of Europe in the 16th century, there was never been military butchery on such a scale. This was no exception. Massacres of Jews followed in every town that was captured, some with their ethnic involvement of local fascists. In the last days in August, over 23,000 were murdered in Christian Protag in the Ukraine, while in Osea, 22nd October, as many as 25,000 were herded into 4 enormous warehouses and burned to death. The oppression of civilians by German forces also and possible allies, those defected Belarusians and Ukrainians who had at first welcomed them with flowers, kisses, and vodka, By the end of September 1941, the Germans were ready to carry on. Their advance towards Moscow, German journalists were told to prepare announcements of its fail. The enemy is broken and will never be in a position to rise again, announced Hitler in a public address. Not for the first time, he spoke too soon. It was true that many of 8 Russian armies were destroyed as they defeated the capital. The Moscow civilians picked as the train to leave the city, but thought the government was moving to Bolshevik Stalin, reminded to take the statue for a military parade to celebrate the 1917 revolution. Meanwhile, 500,000 Russian civilians dug 5,000 miles of defensive ditches around the city. The German attack stalled. Worse for Hitler, winter was setting in. By November, the temperatures around Moscow had dropped to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Even oil froze, and German tank crews had to light fires under their vehicles for up to 4 hours before they could be put into action. At the same time, they had to deal with new Soviet tank, the heavily mobile T-34. General Zhukov had also been reinforced by 25 divisions by the Far East and the South. Russian troops received Rotov, the sensible pre-warmer weather, but since the victory had already been announced, he made a major propaganda reverse. The Germans pressed on Russia to the Moscow team on 2nd December. The Kremlin was viable and dismissed, but 3 days later, Zhukov ordered his own troops into the offense, determined to risk any threat through the icy washes. Hitler ordered his troops to stand firm. For many of them, the consequences became conjugated with ice. Before Christmas, a fierce, ferocious Hitler asked all his group commanders in the open and named himself an army commander-in-chief. Alright, let's go to the next chapter, shall we? The Big Three. America, Britain, and Russia joined forces. The Sleeping Giant. American isolation brought to an end. The U.S. envoy to Britain, Harry Hopkins, was impressed by British morale during the Blitz. If courage can win, the results incredible, reported to President Roosevelt, but added they needed our help desperately. Hopkins had presented to Britain in January 1941 because of the increasingly depressing reports of the American ambassador John F. Kennedy's father, Joseph, about the possibility of British defeat. Hopkins arrived just as Roosevelt laid Wilson in a great the President's powers to present his farewell to the defeat of the USA was passed. However, many Americans, most probably Kennedy and the air hero Charles Lindbergh, opposed lead-lace that believed Roosevelt was to lure the USA into war, in which, in January 1941, the froze all German Italian assaults. The suspicion confront the president and way began the end of a charm offered by Churchill, who sent him regular Christmas messages, bombarded him with news updates, and urged him to work more role on behalf of the relegate allies. Meanwhile, a secret group of British and American officers were discussing what to do if Churchill's encouragement succeeded, because the U.S. public were themselves deeply envious of attempting to draw themselves into a European war. Whoa, Mr. President, again, one newspaper leading column had detected more further time to Roosevelt's, but events on the Atlantic were to prevail beyond the control of and politicians alike. On 10th of April 1941, the U.S. destroyer Nibuk attacked a U-boat which had just sunk a Dutch fighter. 6 months later, another destroyer, Robert James, was torpedoed and sunk, the loss of all of its crew. Hitler's torpedo was distracted at every American, said Russia, and a setback for individuals like himself. Americans were prepared to send aid to a democratic country such as Britain, but it would take a miracle for them for the supplies to our allies of the communists. For the moment, then the British had to make do with the American naval support alone. An understanding reached in August 1941 when Churchill and Roosevelt met on board the Royal Navy battleship Prince of Wales in Printemps Bay, Newfoundland. But little headway was made by the British Prime Minister in the efforts to secure a number of agents of protection. Yet, where Churchill's term often failed, the Japanese succeeded with an all-out assault on 7th December 1941. Their aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor, and America was at war in the Pacific. The next day, Churchill declared war on the Japanese ahead of the Americans' declaration by Congress. The other British allies followed, including China, which formally declared war against both Japan and Germany. On 11th December, there were even better news as far as Britain was concerned. Hitler declared war on the USA. He might have delayed, hoping that America expended its fury at Japan alone, but seemed likely was convinced the USA was about to enter the war against him anyways. For his part, Churchill knew the U.S. involvement in Europe would mean eventual victory. Knew that night he wrote beside the sun with emotion and excitation. I went to bed and slept that night for saved and thankful. But the USA was completely unprepared for war. Fighting the Japanese was one matter. As for Europe, should U.S. forces attack in Africa, Italy, or France first? And should strategic bombing alone win the war, as the British and American Air Force commands believed? What issues had to be resolved were quickly due to Churchill went up to Washington to urge Roosevelt to boost into production and help set some kind of general strategy. New Year's Day 1942 saw the publication of a joint declaration by the two leaders in Washington, endured by 26 countries calling themselves the United Nations, to ensure life, liberty, individuals, and religious freedom, and to preserve the right of many men in justice. Churchill needed the U.S. to act decisively for the early months of 1942. Where the hard for Britain did not only did it have enduring food and coal, but Singapore had been lost to the Japanese, and the island of Malta, bombarded and starving, were seriously threatened in the Mediterranean. The Prime Minister leadership was coming in for public criticism. The first Arctic convoys were now taking supplies to the Russians at Archangel to threaten them. Hitler ordered Sumter and Chisholm to make a dash through the English Channel to Norway, where the Bismarck sister ship, Enterprise, joined them. Afraid that these raids had put to sea, the British naval chief Sir Dudley Brun ordered the convoy PK-17 to scatter as many as 24 out of the convoy. 35 merchant ships were picked up off by U-boats, and all, as it turned out, because of a false alarm. The British needed to strike back to boost public morale. In March 1942, commandos successfully attacked the only Atlantic dry dock capable of taking torpedoes at St. Nazaire on the French coast. 5 months later, a bigger force of commandos and infantry from Britain, Canada, and the USA attacked the port of Dieppe. It was a catastrophe. 1,000 men were killed and 2,000 taken prisoner, but it provided Allied planners with information about landing techniques later used in Italy and Normandy. On the naval front, however, there had been a number of British successes. Crew was badly damaged by bombers. The Enterprise was bottled up. Its Norwegian forward and the German surface fleet had been effectively neutralized as a fighting force. Anna found it necessary to resign. He was replaced by U-boat commander Karl Dismas, where Rader had been cautious. Dismas was imaginative. His submarines were in elite trained in the effort of terror of living and working under the had already major impact of the war. Later U-boats massive up 30,000 miles, the RAF primary bombing German cities had not yet targeted German submarine pens as they might have. When the Americans found themselves at war, their shipping was badly hit by the wolf packs. In June 1942, the Allies lost another 700,000 tons of shipping. The fires continued to rise until March 1943, when a record number of U-boats were operating in the Atlantic, but American merchant vessels were now much past could be built in little as 4 days. The Allies also destroyer corvette Esbjerg hit back in the wolf packs. It ended up being stopped sonar devices and delayed action depth charges. These were highly successful. In May 1943, for example, 7 U-boats were sank in a single night. Generals informed Hitler that the submarine campaign was in crisis and withdrew the U-boats until new tactics could be developed. In spite of the decisions, the Washington Summit throughout 1942, American and British service chiefs were done in the next in Europe. The British were agreed not to bow to Stalin's pressure and open a second front in Europe just yet. They convinced the Americans that it would fail without proper preparation, set the war efforts back years. Even a blockade in Cherbourg was ruled out, unless the Russians looked in serious danger of defeat. Well, that concludes the Day 7 of the Days of Remembrance. I thank the veterans for fighting for me so I could be free, so I could read best book, and so I can have my own opinions. I can walk freely, and I don't have to worry. Thank you, and this concludes Day 7 of 11 Days of Remembrance.